Sweat smells the same on everyone. That was the first thing Dana Reyes learned at Ironclad MMA, and in 18 months of training it was the only fact of the place that never changed. Everything else, the hierarchy, the noise, the myths men told about themselves, shifted with the wind. Only the smell stayed constant. Salt, rubber, and the mildew that lived permanently in the wall-mounted AC unit that hadn't oppos. T cooled anything since spring. Ironclad sat in a stretch of warehouses on the west side of town, wedged between a taco truck depot and a self-storage facility that always smelled faintly of diesel. It was not a gym for people who wanted mirrors and playlists. There were 2 heavy bags with duct tape over the seams, a wall of dumbbells rusted at the collars, and 1,100 square feet of blue mat that had absorbed 2 decades of other people and oppos' blood, sweat, and the occasional tooth. Cass Whitfield ruled that mat the way a wildfire rules a hillside. Fast, loud, and convinced of its own inevitability. She was 24, 5'9", built with the kind of lean, coiled strength that made her look taller in a cage than she was on paper. 9-1 on the regional circuit, with a highlight reel of finishes that had gotten her sponsorship offers from 2 supplement companies and a standing invitation to guest coach youth camp she never showed up to. She fought like she was always being filmed because increasingly she was a ring light clipped to the cage post most evenings, a phone propped against a folded towel, capturing content for an account with 40,000 followers who loved watching her hurt people who couldn't and oppos. T hurt her back. Dana watched her from the heavy bags most nights, the way you watch whether you can and oppos. T control. 33 years old, an actuary who did risk modeling for an insurance firm downtown. Dana had started training 2 years ago after a divorce that left her feeling like a body she used to live inside of. She wasn't an oppos T fast. She wasn't an oppos T strong. But she showed up 4 nights a week, and somewhere in the second year showing up had started to feel like the actual point. End quote. Hands up, sweetheart, end quote. Cass called out one Tuesday loud enough for the room to a 19-year-old kid named Priya who and oppos. D walked in 3 weeks earlier wanting to learn self-defense before a semester abroad. Priya was maybe 130 pounds, gassed after 90 seconds, her gloves drifting lower with every combination Cass threw. Cass wasn't an oppos T wearing headgear. She never did with beginners, said it kept her honest though everyone understood it meant something closer to it keeps them scared. She flicked a jab that snapped Priya and oppos' head sideways followed by a leg kick that folded the girl and oppos' stance like a drop tent pole. End quote. Come on. Give me something real, end quote. Cass grinned at the small cluster of regulars who and oppos. D drifted toward the mat, phones half raised out of habit. She threw a loose right hook, pulled technically though the word did a lot of work, and it still caught Priya high on the cheekbone hard enough to split skin. Blood freckled the blue mat in a bright, quick arc. Priya went down to one knee, palm pressed to her face, eyes flooding. End quote. Time, end quote. Cass stepped back, gloves raised in mock triumph, already glancing at the ring light to check the angle. End quote. Somebody get her a towel. And clean that up before I slip. End quote. She spat her mouthguard into her palm and walked toward the water station, chest up, unhurried, the posture of someone who had never once considered that the room might not be watching. From the shadow near the equipment closet, Nora Vance emerged with a spray bottle and a roll of blue shop towels, moving like she had all the time in the world and no interest in spending it quickly. Nora was somewhere past 60. Nobody at Ironclad knew exactly how far past, and she and oppos. D never volunteered the number. Silver hair cropped close to her scalp, a face weathered into deep specific lines, like a landscape rather than a complexion. She wore the same thing every night. Gray Dickies, a faded department store t-shirt, orthopedic shoes with soles thick enough to look almost comic beneath her small frame. Her left hip had a hitch in it, a half-second hesitation on every other step, the kind of limp that told you nothing about its origin and everything about how long she and oppos. D been living with it. She was the night cleaner. Most of the fighters didn't and oppos. T know her last name. A few of the newer members wearing and oppos. T sure she had one, the way children assume teachers don and oppos. T exist outside the classroom. She knelt beside the blood on the mat, sprayed it, waited 3 seconds by some internal clock, wiped, folded the towel to a clean face and wiped again. She did this without hurry and without any apparent awareness that a room of athletes was breathing around her. Cass drank from a gallon jug near the water station and watched the old woman work. Something about that unbothered economy of motion needled her, though she couldn't and oppose. T have said exactly why. Nora didn't and oppose. T perform deference. She didn't and oppose. T perform anything. And in a room built entirely out of performance, that omission felt to Cass like an insult she couldn't and oppose. T quite name. And quote, "You missed a spot, Gran," and quote, Cass called out. Nora didn't and oppose. T look up. She finished the section she was on, stood, knees popping audibly, and dropped the towel into the biohazard bin bolted by the door. And quote, "It and oppose s clean," and quote, she said. Her voice had the texture of gravel settling. Low, unhurried, entirely without inflection. She turned back toward the closet. A couple of the guys near the free weights laughed, more from surprise than amusement, and the sound died fast when Cass and Oppo's head snapped toward them. The room went quiet again, quiet in the specific way that meant everyone had decided, individually and instantly, to become very interested in their own workouts. Cass watched Nora and Oppo's retreating back with her jaw tight. She hated being dismissed the way other people hated heights, reflexively, physically, as a violation of the natural order. And quote, "Careful," and quote, Cass called after her, loud enough to be heard, and quote, "Or I and Oppos. I'll have you scrubbing toilets with a toothbrush, Gran." End quote. Nora didn't and Oppos. T break stride. She pulled the string on the closet light and shut the door behind her, and for a moment the whole gym seemed to exhale. Dana had noticed Nora before that night. You couldn't and Oppos. T not notice her the way you don and Oppos. T notice a support beam until you look for it, but it was that exchange that made her actually watch. There was something in the old woman and Oppos' stillness that didn't and Oppos. T matched the rest of the room and Oppos' math. Everyone else at Ironclad postured, tensed, projected. Nora simply existed at a lower frequency like she and Oppos. D already survived whatever the room was trying to prove it could survive. Dana caught the small details over the following weeks, the way you notice a word once you and Oppos learned it and then see it everywhere. Nora and Oppos' left pinky, she realized one evening while the old woman was wringing out a mop, ended cleanly at the second knuckle. Not injured, healed, an old amputation gone smooth with decades. Her knuckles on both hands were flattened and thick, the kind of calcification that came from repeated blunt impact over a very long time, not from arthritis. A scar ran pale and ropey from the heel of her right palm up across the wrist crease, the kind of mark that comes from a blade, not a fall. Dana didn't and Oppos. T ask about any of it. Something in her understood, without being told, that the details wherein and Oppos. T offered for conversation. Friday nights at Ironclad were chaos by design, open mat. The schedule cleared for anyone from partner gyms across the city to drop in and roll. The stereo ran a hard, thumping playlist that vibrated up through the floor mats. The mirrors along the west wall fogged with breath within the first hour. Cass had a bad night. A visiting brown belt from a jiu-jitsu academy across town caught her in an armbar during a grappling round, and Cass, true to form, refused to tap until the joint was one bad angle from tearing. Her coach had to physically intervene. She and Oppos. D walked off the mat rubbing her elbow, humiliated in front of 40,000 potential viewers who hadn't and Oppos. T even been filming, and that particular kind of humiliation, the kind with no footage to control the narrative afterward, curdled in her for the rest of the night. Across the room, Nora was on her knees by a bank of lockers, working a jammed latch loose with a flathead screwdriver and a rubber mallet. Someone had crammed a duffel too large into cubby 14 and warped the hinge. She worked with the same unhurried rhythm she brought to everything, clink, clink, clink. A small steady sound cutting under the bass line. To Cass, pacing the edge of the mat with her elbow throbbing and her ego bruised in a way that demanded correction, that sound became, over the course of 10 minutes, unbearable. End quote. Hey. End quote. She crossed the gym without deciding to, the crowd parting the way it always did when Cass moved with intention. End quote. Hey. Old woman. End quote. Nora kept working. Clink. Cass kicked the side of the small red toolbox at Nora and Oppos' knee. Not hard enough to send it flying, just hard enough to tip it, spilling sockets and screws across the rubber floor tiles in a bright metallic clatter. Someone at the front desk, sensing the shift in the room and Oppos' air pressure the way people learn to sense weather, cut the music. The silence that followed had weight to it. Only the traffic outside and the squeak of someone and Oppos' S shoes remained. Nora stopped moving. She didn't and oppose. T flinched didn't and oppose. T gasped. She set the mallet and screwdriver down with the same unhurried care she brought to everything, looked at the scattered tools and then up at Cass. End quote. Oops, end quote. Cass said and smiled at the small crowd that had drifted closer, phones angling up out of habit. End quote. Foot slipped. Hard to see with all this junk on the floor. End quote. A couple of Cass and Oppo's usual training partners laughed on cue. Nora said nothing. She turned knee-popping and began gathering the tools back into the box. A socket, a handful of screws, methodical, unbothered. The silence was defeating Cass and Oppo's purpose. She wanted noise. She wanted the old woman to yell or cower, or do literally anything that would let Cass point to a reaction and call it justified. End quote, end quote. Cass said, crouching slightly to bring her face closer to Nora and Oppo's level, playing now to the room rather than to Nora herself. End quote. You and Oppo's, a pretty depressing thing to look at. 60-something years old, smelling like bleach, picking up trash after people half your age. What happened? Husband leave? Kids stop calling. End quote. Nora closed the toolbox lid, gripped the handle, stood, favoring her right leg, using the locker bank for balance. End quote. Move, end quote, she said. No heat in it. A flat statement of fact, the kind you and Oppo's used to describe a door being in the way. Cass laughed, a short, ugly sound. End quote. Excuse me? You and Oppo's, the one standing on my rag. End quote. She pointed down. Under Cass and Oppo's bare left foot was a gray shop towel Nora had been using to wipe grease from a hinge. End quote. Lift your foot, end quote, Nora said. End quote. Make me. End quote. Cass spread her arms slightly, weight forward, chin down, the posture of someone inviting a reason. End quote. Come on. Show me that old lady strength. Give me something. End quote. From the weight rack, Dana had already stopped what she was doing. She and Oppo's felt the temperature of the room change the way she and Oppo's learned to feel a market shift before the numbers caught up. End quote. Cass. End quote. She stepped forward. End quote. Leave it. She and Oppo's just doing her job. End quote. End quote. Stay out of it, Riz. End quote. Cass didn't and Oppo's look away from Nora. End quote. This doesn't and Oppo's concern you. End quote. Nora let out a slow breath, tired, not afraid, and bent to retrieve the rag anyway, ignoring the foot still planted on it. She reached with her left hand. It was the excuse Cass had been building toward for 10 minutes without admitting it to herself. Cass moved fast, she was always fast, snatching Nora and Oppo's outstretched wrist and yanking upward, intending a quick, humiliating toss to the mat, the kind of thing that would read as a joke in the video she and Oppo's absolutely already imagined posting. Nora didn't and Oppo's fly backward. What Cass felt instead, in the half-second before her brain caught up to her hand, was resistance with no give in it at all, like she and Oppo's grabbed something bolted to the floor. Nora didn't and Oppo's pull away. She stepped into the pull, her worn shoe finding a base between Cass and Oppo's wide stance, her hips dropping a fraction below Cass and Oppo's center of gravity before Cass had finished the thought of throwing her. End quote. Watch this, end quote. Cass said too loudly, covering the sudden wrongness in her balance, stepping her back leg out to twist the wrist behind Nora and Oppo's spine and force her down. Nora and Oppo's face didn't and Oppo's change. As Cass twisted, Nora rotated her trapped wrist a few degrees, just enough to slip the angle, turning her palm toward Cass and Oppo's forearm. Her free hand, the one that had been hanging loose and unthreatening at her side, rose without hurry and met Cass and Oppo's gripping hand. She didn't and Oppo's grabbed the wrist. She ignored the forearm entirely. Her hand slid over Cass and Oppo's knuckles and isolated the thumb, the whole motion so small and so quiet that from 10 feet away it looked, to Dana, like the old woman had simply patted Cass and Oppo's hand. Nora and Oppo's thumb locked over the base of Cass and Oppo's pinning it. Her index finger, thick, scarred, calloused in a way that told a longer story than anyone in that room would ever hear, curled around the middle joint of Cass and Oppo's thumb, already bent past where it wanted to go. Nora didn't and oppose. T use her shoulder. She didn't and oppose. T heave. She pinned the isolated joint against her own sternum, locked her elbows to her ribs, and dropped her weight a few inches and slightly to the side, turning her whole small body into a fulcrum on one single joint the size of a walnut. Crack. The sound was quiet. In the total silence of the gym, it landed like a door slamming in an empty house. The pain didn't and oppose. T arrive in stages. It arrived complete, up through Cass and Oppo's wrist, her forearm, her shoulder, detonating somewhere behind her eyes before conscious thought had time to organize a response. Her knees hit the mat before she and Oppo's D decided to kneel. The sound that came out of her was and Oppo's T a roar. It was high, thin, involuntary, the sound of a body that had run entirely out of choices. She knelt there, hips twisted, face inches from the gray rag she and Oppo's D stepped on 90 seconds earlier, left arm pinned upward in the old woman and Oppo's grip. Nora stood over her, perfectly still, holding the lock with what looked like no effort at all. Her breathing hadn't and Oppo's T changed. Her expression hadn't and Oppo's T changed. She looked, if anything, bored. End quote. Let go, end quote. Cass and Oppo's free hand slapped frantically against her own thigh, an instinctive tap-out aimed at nothing because there was no one to tap. End quote. Please. Please, it and Oppo's going to snap, end quote. 30 people stood frozen around the edge of the mat, phones forgotten in half-raised hands, watching the undefeated star of ironclad MMA weep on her knees, brought down by a single joint in the grip of a woman a foot shorter and 40 pounds lighter. Nora leaned in slightly, low enough that only Cass could hear her. End quote. You spent all this time learning how to hurt people, end quote. The gravel in her voice scraped low, almost gentle. End quote. You never learned how to break. End quote. She applied one more careful degree of pressure. Cass sobbed. A real sound now, ugly and unrehearsed, nothing like the noises she made for cameras. Nora held it 3 more seconds, long enough for the silence in the room to finish its work. Then she opened her hand and let go, stepping back a half pace, not pushing, not gloating. Cass folded forward onto the mat, curling around her hand, rocking, tears and spit blurring together on her face as she stared at her own rapidly purpling thumb. Nora bent, unhurried, and retrieved her rag, folded it into a neat square, tucked it into her back pocket, picked up the red toolbox, looked once around the ring of frozen faces, no triumph in it, nothing performed, and turned back toward the closet. End quote. Dawn and Oppo's T leave a mess, end quote. She said to no one in particular, and the door shut behind her with a clank that was, for 10 full seconds, the loudest sound in the building. Coach Marisol Ortiz pushed through the crowd before the door had finished echoing. 41, ex-fighter, ran ironclad to cover the mortgage after her own career ended in a torn ACL nobody remembered to ask about. She cared about exactly 2 things in that gym: liability and revenue, usually in that order. End quote. What happened? End quote. Not a question. She knelt by Cass, reaching for the hand. Cass flinched away with a sound like a wounded animal. End quote. Dawn and Oppo's to the old woman, she broke it, end quote. Marisol looked up at the ring of silent fighters. End quote. Nora did this. End quote. Nobody wanted to be first. Admitting you and Oppo's D just watched the gym and Oppo's cleaning lady folded star athlete in 3 seconds felt, to most of the room, like admitting to a hallucination. Dana stepped forward. End quote. Cass stepped on Nora and Oppo's rag and Wooden and Oppo's T move. Nora tried to pick it up anyway. Cass grabbed her wrist. Nora put a lock on the thumb and dropped her weight. Whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. End quote. Marisol and Oppo's expression didn't and Oppo's T moved toward sympathy. It moved toward math. Her head was down, shoulders folded inward. The whole practiced architecture of her public self collapsed into something small and scared, hurrying toward the locker room without once looking at the closet door. The gym emptied out slowly, in the low murmurs of people who and Oppo's D witnessed something they didn't and Oppo's T have language for yet. Dana didn't and Oppo's T go back to the bags. Her mind, trained for years to hunt down the load-bearing variable in a mess of noisy data, had snagged completely on the mechanics of what she and Oppo's D just watched. Cass was strong, fast, primed on adrenaline. Nora was slow, old, visibly breaking down in half her joints. And yet the outcome hadn't been close. Dana understood in the analytical part of her brain that never fully switched off, that this wasn't magic. The human body was levers and torque and center of mass, the same as any structure she modeled for a living. Force times radius times the sine of the angle between them. Nora hadn't needed strength. She and maximized the radius by isolating the smallest, farthest joint from the body and S center, and she and D applied the force at precisely 90 degrees, where every unit of it did maximum work. It wasn't a secret. It was engineering. Somebody had simply spent a lifetime learning it in a place where the lessons weren't optional. Dana waited. 2 hours later, the gym was empty and dark except for the security lights, which cast long bruised shadows across the mat. Dana sat in her car in the lot, windows down, engine off, watching the side exit. At 1:45, the steel door creaked open and Nora came out hauling a trash bag full of crushed energy drink cans and wet paper towels. She limped it to the dumpster, hefted it in with a small grunt, and let the lid slam. Then she leaned against the cold metal for a moment, rubbing the small of her back with a scarred hand. She looked, in that unguarded moment, every one of her years. The machine that had dismantled Cass in 4 seconds was nowhere visible in the tired woman rubbing her spine in an empty parking lot. Dana got out. Gravel crunched under her shoes. Nora didn't startle. She just looked mildly put out. Gym and closed. Come back tomorrow. I saw what you did. Dana stopped 10 feet away, some instinct telling her to give the same space she and D have given Cass. Nora pulled a crushed pack of off-brand cigarettes from her pocket, lit one with a cheap plastic lighter, the flame briefly carving her face out of the dark. She exhaled slow. You saw a kid trip over her own ego. Nothing more. That wasn't a trip. Dana kept her voice even. That was a standing thumb lock off a wrist grab. You isolated the joint, pinned your elbows to your ribs so she couldn't spin free, and dropped your center of gravity through the lock instead of pulling with your arm. That and not instinct. That and drilled 1,000 times. Nora studied her for a long moment, the cigarette forgotten between 2 fingers. You watch too many videos, kid. Go home. I do risk modeling for an insurance company. I spend my whole day watching for the variable everyone else missed. Dana nodded toward the dark building behind them. Those people in there train for a cage. Referee rules padded floor. You weren't training for any of that. Nora and S laugh was dry, short, barely a sound at all. I don't train accountant. She dropped ash onto the asphalt. I survive. It and a different discipline. She turned toward a faded blue pickup parked under a flickering street lamp. Dana followed, not crowding, just close enough to still be spoken to. Where and do you learn it? Judo? Catch wrestling? Were you in the service? Nora stopped at the driver and S door, hand on the handle, and looked back. The annoyance in her face had drained into something heavier. You want a story. You want an old lady to hand you a secret so you feel dangerous at your desk job. Her voice dropped, losing the last of its janitor register, going flat and cold. There and s no secret. There and s anatomy. And there and s consequence. She held up her left hand under the streetlight, and for the first time Dana saw the details up close instead of stolen in glances across a gym floor. The pinky gone clean at the second knuckle, the knuckles flattened and swollen with old calcium, the pale rope of scar tracking from the base of the thumb across the palm into the wrist crease. 25 years as a corrections officer at a maximum security facility in Nevada. Nora said quietly. Before that, I worked the door at a biker bar outside Reno for 6 years, back when that meant something different than it does now. I never fought for a belt. Nobody ever stepped in when I was tired. I fought people who had nothing left to lose, who and oppose. D bite your ear off or work a shank into your side because they didn't and oppose. T like how you looked at them that morning and quote. She lowered her hand. And quote. You learn fast which joints fail first. You learn that pain stops people better than handcuffs do. And you learn that violence is a filthy thing that doesn't and oppose. T wash all the way out, no matter how much bleach you use, and quote. She tipped her head back toward the dark gym. And quote. That girl in there thinks hurting people is proof of something. She doesn't and oppose. T know the first thing about pain. Tonight I just introduced them. End quote. End quote. Will you teach me? End quote. It came out of Dana before she and oppose. D decided to say it. Nora looked at her. Not annoyed this time, something closer to pity. End quote. No. Because if you and oppose, lucky you and oppose, LL go your whole life never needing to know what I know. End quote. She pulled the door open, hinges shrieking. End quote. Go home. Be grateful your worst Tuesday is a paper cut. End quote. She climbed in, started the engine and pulled away, leaving Dana alone under the buzzing light. Cass didn't and oppose. T come back the next week. Gym gossip settled on grade 2 ligament sprain, though nobody who and oppose. D been on the mat believed that was the whole story. Her account went quiet. No new clips, no gym footage, the ring light unclipped from the cage post and never reattached. The small orbit of training partners who and oppose. D laughed on cue, found a new center of gravity within days. A heavy-handed 20-year-old named Trey started getting the loud praise. The phones angled his way during rounds, the same performance rebooting itself around a new face like nothing at all had happened. Dana watched it happen with a clarity that made her slightly sick. Nobody at Ironclad had learned anything. The gym had simply replaced its centerpiece and kept running the same show. She caught herself one evening watching Trey bark at a nervous newcomer the exact way Cass used to, and understood, really understood in her stomach, not just her head, what Nora had meant about violence not washing out. It didn't and oppose. T just live in the person who used it. It lived in the room that rewarded it. She started training differently after that. Slower. She stopped trying to hit the bag as hard as she physically could and started paying attention instead. Footwork, balance, the specific geometry of where her weight actually lived when she threw a strike. Tension, she was starting to understand, was the enemy of power, not the source of it. When you fought a movement, you built resistance into it. When you let it flow through the right angle, you barely had to fight at all. She didn't and oppose. T tell anyone about the parking lot conversation. The truth was heavier than the rumor, and she understood with a certainty she couldn't and oppose. T fully explained that the room wasn't and oppose. T built to carry it. 3 weeks after the thumb lock, a college kid named Marcus, one of Trey and Oppo's new circle 22, built like a linebacker and half as careful, decided the gym and Oppo's ghost story needed testing. It was a slow Wednesday. Nora was resetting a fire extinguisher bracket near the side door, a small screwdriver in hand, when Marcus wandered over with 2 friends trailing behind him, clearly having discussed this on the way over. End quote. Hey, end quote. He said, not unkindly, more curious than cruel. The tone of someone poking a rumor to see if it and Oppo's real. End quote. You and Oppo's. The one who broke Cass and Oppo's hand? End quote. Nora didn't and Oppo's. T look up from the bracket. End quote. Move your foot. You and Oppo's on my cord. End quote. He looked down. He wasn't and Oppo's T. He grinned at his friends, stepped deliberately onto the extension cord anyway, testing. End quote. Careful, end quote, he said. End quote. Heard you and Oppo's dangerous. End quote. Dana, wiping down a bench 20 feet away, felt her whole body go still, the old dread rising in her throat before she and Oppo's consciously registered why. Nora set the screwdriver down, straightened, favoring the bad hip, looked at Marcus for a long, end quote. Nora reached down, slow and unbothered, and simply unplugged the cord from the outlet instead of asking him to move again. The tension went out of it entirely. There was nothing left to stand on. End quote. It and Oppo's supposed to save us both 20 minutes at urgent care. End quote. She coiled the now slack cord loosely around her forearm and walked past him toward the supply closet, leaving Marcus standing on a cord that no longer connected to anything, his 2 friends laughing before he and Oppo's fully understood he and Oppo's lost. Dana exhaled. It took her a second to place the feeling that moved through her watching it. Not relief exactly. Recognition. That and Oppos. The lesson, she thought. Not the lock. This. She didn't and Oppos. Need to break anything to win. She only broke Cass because Cass made it the only option left. The following Thursday, Coach Ortiz caught Dana near the front desk after class, holding a clipboard she wasn't in Oppos. Really looking at. End quote. You were there, end quote, Marisol said. Not a question again, she seemed constitutionally incapable of asking them. End quote, the thumb thing. End quote. End quote, I was there. End quote. Marisol glanced toward the closet, where the light under the door showed Nora still working. End quote, I and Oppos. V had her on payroll 4 years. Never had a single complaint, never asked for a raise, never called in sick once. I genuinely never thought about her twice, end quote. She turned the clipboard over in her hands, an unusual tell for a woman who otherwise gave nothing away. End quote. Cass filed a claim through her insurance. Said it happened during a training accident. Didn't end Oppos. Mention Nora at all. End quote. Dana raised an eyebrow. End quote. Why would she cover for her? End quote. End quote, my guess? End quote, Marisol and Oppos. Mouth did something that wasn't and Oppos. Quite a smile. End quote. Because the true version makes her look worse than a training accident does. A sprain from sparring is just bad luck. Getting folded by the cleaning staff over a rag is the kind of thing that follows you. End quote. She shook her head slowly. End quote, anyway. I bumped Nora and Oppos' hours. Told her I Dawn and Oppos. Want her doing the heavy floor work solo past 11 anymore. Not with that hip. She told me to mind my business. End quote. A short laugh. End quote. She and Oppos. Not wrong that it and Oppos. Not mine. But I and Oppos. Am minding it anyway. End quote. It wasn't an Oppos restitution exactly. But it was the first time in 4 years anyone at Ironclad had looked directly at Nora and adjusted anything because of what they saw. 6 weeks later, on a night when a hard rain hammered the gym and Oppos' tin roof and drowned out the traffic outside, Dana stayed late working through a set alone in the back corner, using the time to think through a coverage model that wasn't and Oppos' cooperating with her at the office. At 11, the main lights cut and the perimeter bulbs took over. Nora came out of the closet with the big industrial mop and a bucket, moving worse than usual. The damp always got into her joints, turning the limp into something heavier, a drag that pulled her whole right shoulder down with each step. She pushed the mop in long strokes, wincing audibly when she leaned into it, and finally stopped altogether, propping herself on the handle, eyes shut, breathing shallow. The invincible woman from the parking lot was nowhere visible. This was just the cost of that night, finally being paid in full. The sudden drop through her hips, the torque through a spine that had absorbed 30 years of impact before Dana had ever met her, still charging interest. Dana set down her wraps and walked out onto the mat barefoot. Nora heard her coming and opened her eyes, jaw setting into a stubborn line, already bracing against whatever was about to be offered. End quote, Jim and Oppos' closed accountant. End quote. End quote, I know. End quote. Nora pushed the mop again, leg buckling slightly on the follow-through, catching herself on the handle with a sharp intake of breath. Dana stepped up and put her hand on the wood, just above Nora and Oppos' grip. End quote, let go. I Dawn and Oppos need it. End quote. End quote, I and Oppos am not helping. End quote, Dana kept her voice level. End quote, my calves are tight. I need the resistance to stretch. End quote. They stood there a moment, 2 sets of hands on one mop handle, the rain drumming steady overhead. Nora and Oppos' eyes held hers, not hostile, just assessing the way she and Oppos' assessed Marcus and Oppos' cord, weighing whether this was a fight worth having. Then slowly the tension went out of her shoulders. She let go. End quote. Wring it out tight, end quote, Nora said, turning toward the bench. End quote. Leave it wet and the rubber warps. End quote. End quote, got it. End quote. Nora sat, pulled a small tin of mentholated rub from her pocket, and worked it into her swollen knuckles while Dana mopped the mats in long, overlapping strokes exactly the way she and Oppos' watched Nora do it 100 times, Weight through the hips, not the arms, letting her body do the work the mop was designed to make easy. They didn't and Oppo's tea talk. Dana understood by now that this was its own kind of conversation. When she finished, she rinsed the bucket, hung the mop, and came back out to find Nora still on the bench, elbows on her knees, looking at the clean, gleaming floor like it was a small private accomplishment nobody else would notice. And quote, "It and Oppo's done," and quote, Dana said. Nora nodded once. She didn't and Oppo's tea say thanks. The gesture hadn't and Oppo's tea been asking for any. Dana was almost to the door when Nora and Oppo's voice stopped her. And quote, "Hey, accountant." And quote, Dana turned. And quote, "Your right hand drops when you get tired," and quote, Nora said, pointing a scarred finger at her own jaw. And quote, "Third round every time. Someone faster than you is going to put you to sleep with it if you don and Oppo's tea fixed that before it and Oppo's a habit." End quote. A small real smile broke across Dana and Oppo's face. End quote, "I and Oppo's I'll fix it." End quote. End quote, "Don and Oppo's tea thank me." End quote. Nora reached for the light switch. End quote, "I Don and Oppo's tea want to be the one mopping up your blood." End quote. The gym went dark except for the streetlight bleeding orange through the high windows. Dana walked out into air that smelled like wet concrete, and for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she didn't and Oppo's tea carry the low hum of Monday and Oppo's dread out to the car with her. She just felt like she was standing in her own body on her own 2 feet, for the length of the whole walk to the parking lot. Cass came back to Ironclad twice more that year. Once in a soft cast, watching from the bleachers with an expression nobody could quite read. And once for months later, to fight on the regional card Marisol had rebuilt the marketing around someone else. She lost a decision in the second round, tired and tentative in a way she and Oppo's never been before, throwing combinations that pulled at the last second the way careful people and Oppo's punches do. She didn't and Oppo's come back a third time. There was no dramatic scene, no confrontation. No final reckoning captured on anyone in Oppo's phone. She simply stopped showing up the way people do when a room has quietly stopped being theirs, and the gym absorbed the absence the same way it absorbed everything else, a little quieter for a week and then not. Ironclad itself changed by degrees too small to name in any one moment. The sparring got a little less vicious. The insults thrown across the mat for an audience grew rarer, then rare enough to be noticeable when they happened at all. Something had settled into the room and Oppo's understanding of itself, a fact nobody said out loud but everybody now, somewhere underneath their training, seemed to know. The toughest person in the building had never once needed anyone to watch her prove it. She was the one with the mop.